Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Solo ReacTalk. This morning, I'm going to be reacting to a playlist, requested by Antioch 2222. It's called Extra History: The First Crusade. Yes, made on the Extra History YouTube channel. Yes, that's what I'm going to be reacting to today. And let me just check. I think there's about 7 or 8 videos on the playlist, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to be reacting to all of them. And if you guys want to check out my previous reaction to other Extra History video content, the playlist card is going to be at the top right here. You'll be able to access my other reactions from Extra History. And thank you again to Antioch 2222 for the request. Yeah, I have been gone for some time, like a week. I thought maybe I was having some sort of like a seasonal depression, because the season has changed in South Africa and it's been raining non-stop for at least like 2 days last week, and I was just feeling so down. I also thought maybe it was some sort of like low-level burnout. So yeah, I just took a rest until today, Monday. And yeah, no, it was really good. It was really necessary, and yeah, I feel far more, I got more energy. Okay, let's start with this reaction to The First Crusade on the Extra History YouTube channel. I know about the Crusades. I know about, you know, the Christian world versus the Islamic world fighting over the religious sites or religious cities, you know, that belong to both religions, if I can say that. And I don't know anything about the First Crusade. I just know that there have been crusades in the past, in the Middle Ages. And yeah, let's see how it all started, how it all began with the First Crusade. Yeah, this is going to be interesting. Okay, let's start. 3, 2, 1, go.
The year is 1095 CE. We stand at the Council of Clermont. In the audience are all the great names of Europe, secular and ecclesiastic. For a moment, there's a hush. The last words of Pope Urban II's fiery speech extolling nations of Christendom to retake the Holy Land from Muslim invaders hangs in the air.
Pope Urban. Okay. Interesting name, Urban. This... okay.
Then someone in the crowd shouts, "Deus vult! God wills it!" The chant is picked up by man after man until the council rings with deafening shouts of Deus vult.
You know, there's a movie called Kingdom of Heaven. Yeah, it's also based on the Crusades. There is a king called, I think it was King Baldwin the Third or the Fourth, who had leprosy, and he had like a silver mask on his face to protect, well, yeah, he had leprosy. And he had a council meeting or some sort of lands meet with the important lords and the knights of his realm, and you know, they were discussing whether they should go to war with Salah ad-Din, the leader of the Islamic, I think it was a sultan. Yeah, I think, yeah, he was a leader of those who belong to the Islamic faith. And yeah, his knights, King Baldwin's knights, would scream out, "God's will, God wills it," every single time when you know, they had to make a decision whether they had to go to war with Salah ad-Din. So yeah, this reminds me of that movie, Kingdom of Heaven. It was a very nice movie, very, very nice movie. I like the music, I like the cinematography, I like the siege of Jerusalem. You know how they, you know, showed a siege happening to a city, and you know, the catapults and the trebuchets, and you know, all the different types of forces that were used, you know, in those days of bombardment on the city, until the city was relinquished to Salah ad-Din. So yeah, it was a nice, very interesting movie, Kingdom of Heaven. Watch it.
Then, out of the crowd, a bishop named Adhemar rushes up and falls to his
Adhemar. Uh, okay.
His knees before the Pope, proclaiming that he will lead any willing Christian to reclaim the Holy Land for Christ. And thus the First Crusade began. There's just a few problems. You see, by this point, Muslims had actually occupied the Holy Land for nearly 400 years, and there was little evidence of the various atrocities Urban invoked in his speech to incite Europe to crusade. In fact, the Church had never seemed very concerned about the occupation before now, and pilgrimages to the Holy Land had continued practically uninterrupted since Jerusalem fell into Muslim hands in 637.
Clearly, this is a political decision. I don't know what's happening with Pope Urban's position as Pope, or the economy of the Christian world, the European continent. I'm not sure what is going on in terms of the Christian state, but it seems as if Pope Urban II is using this notion of the Islamic world is controlling Jerusalem, therefore we must commence a crusade to free or liberate Jerusalem from their control, as a tool for his own purposes, whether it's for him to stay in power as a pope, or I don't know, to make sure that the Christian world is stable, that they have a united enemy to focus their attention on and not fight amongst each other. So clearly this is some sort of political decision making right here. He's prepared to throw the lives of many men and women, or should I say men? Because mainly it's men who are fighting. He's prepared to throw the lives of many men down this war against the Islamic world, purely for his own political interests. Yeah, because there's never been a problem before. 400 years. The city has been controlled under those who belong to the Islamic faith, and nothing has happened until now. Now there's a problem. Nah, it's a political decision, definitely.
So what was really going on? Well, earlier that year, Alexius Komnenos...
Who? Alexius Komnenos. I don't know, it sounds like a Roman name. Alexius Komnenos. Yeah, it sounds like a Roman.
The emperor of the Byzantine Empire.
Alright. Emperor of the Byzantine Empire.
An empire that had fallen a long way since the days of Justinian, had sent envoys to the Pope asking for help from the West against the Seljuk Turks. These Turkish Muslims coming out of the East had practically pushed the empire to its limits, forcing them out of nearly all of Anatolia, the traditional heartland of his empire.
And Anatolia is going to become part of the Ottoman Empire. Well, that's far into the future, right? Yeah. The Ottoman Empire is going to consist of Anatolia and Constantinople. It's going to become the capital of that new empire once the Byzantine Empire has fallen. Yeah, but I'm moving too far ahead now. Let's get back to the crusade.
Alexius Komnenos had hoped for supplies, arms, and a few thousand well-trained men so that Byzantium could continue to serve as the bulwark of Christian Europe against the Muslim East, or really so he could just win this war, retake his territory, and strengthen the empire he was the head of, but...
Both can be true. Both can be true.
It's all in how you sell it. Well, Pope Urban had a slightly different idea. You see, the Pope wasn't in the most secure position. The Church was basically at war with the Holy Roman Emperor. Another Pope named Clement III had been installed in Ravenna, and claimed to be the rightful Pope. In fact, Urban couldn't even enter Rome, hence why he was kicking around in France, because the Holy Roman Emperor and the Antipope held it against him.
So, the de facto capital of the Christian faith is in France at this very moment with Pope Urban II. It's not based in Rome. Wow.
So Urban thought, maybe let's unite all of Christendom to fight somebody else. Of course, he never really asked for Alexius Komnenos' opinion on this plan, but we'll deal with that more later. And thus, the First Crusade began. But Urban was a smart guy. He knew how to motivate people. He knew how to gather a force larger and more cohesive than any nation in Europe could muster. He would offer to those who had spent their life fighting, those who had spent their lives committing mortal sins, one chance, one opportunity for absolution. And he would offer that opportunity for doing the thing they did best, going to war.
So, in order for them to get absolution, they must first fight against those who belong to the Islamic faith. That's crazy. In order for you to be forgiven and to go to heaven, you have to kill people. And those people, of course, they belong to a different religion, but essentially you have to kill people. You have to conquer a city. And conquering cities is not just, people surrendering and you just walk in and you take over the government offices. No, you are burning down cities. You are destroying infrastructure. You are killing people in the name of your God. And your God is going to forgive you because you have taken over Jerusalem. Yeah.
This is the first time a pope had ever done this. Never before had a plenary indulgence been offered for martial action, and this innovation drew a lot of people. And truth is, though I may have my suspicions about some of the motivations of the leaders of this movement, in a world as motivated by faith as medieval Europe, I think that faith and a hope for absolution was the reason that so many people bankrupted themselves just so they could join the crusade.
Yeah, especially because it's during the Middle Ages and, religion was a part of your life, was a part of your soul. It's what you breathed in and breathed out. It's what you spoke. It's what you ate. It's what you dreamt about. It's what you believed in. Religion was very, tight with society. Or should I say, the society of the Middle Ages. The many different kingdoms and vassals across Europe, and also the Islamic world. They also were very connected, very tied to their religion. Their entire ethos, their way of living, their way of being was tied to their religion as well, just like the Christians of Europe. So yeah, I guess it's understandable, but it's just crazy. In order for you to get absolution, you have to kill people. Wow.
But, unfortunately, this offer was so good that a lot of people who signed up weren't quite the people the Pope meant to get. You see, the Pope had set a date of August 1096 for the Crusaders to leave from Europe, so that knights and barons could get their affairs in order, and so that they could prepare what in the Middle Ages counted as supply and logistics. But that wasn't fast enough for some people. In France, there was a fellow by the name of Peter the Hermit.
Peter the Hermit.
Who began whipping up the peasantry. He talked of the atrocities he'd witnessed in the Holy Land, although there's a fair amount of evidence to say that he never actually went there, and he told tales of his divine appointment by Christ to lead the spiritually pure who would be protected by heaven to Jerusalem.
Seriously? And the church allowed this Peter the Hermit to continue spouting this nonsense? Because it's the church that's supposed to be having, or should I say, conveying the words of God. They are the middlemen. There's God. God is speaking to the church speaks to the people. And now Peter the Hermit is circumventing that responsibility or that power base that the church has. And he's saying that God spoke to me. That's heresy. That's heresy. That's heresy. And now he's saying that the people are going to be protected by the Lord as they head over to Jerusalem. Wow. I'm surprised that the church hasn't, arrested this man and tried him for heresy and then burnt him on a stake.
Tens of thousands of people left their farms to join Peter, although they had no money for the journey and didn't even know how far it was from their homes in Western Europe to the Levant.
I can tell you now, it's not going to be 2 days.
Few of them were soldiers, and fewer still even owned weapons. But as Peter preached, word of this peasants' crusade began. And while Peter was still gathering his tide of peasants at Cologne, other groups decided that they were just going to set out on their own. And this is where the People's Crusade becomes one of the most unmitigated messes in the history of history.
I like this image. Shock tornadoes. Yeah. There was a movie based on something like this, where there would be a tornado forming on the ocean, and it would suck up some sharks into the tornado, and the tornado would drag, all those sharks all the way to, the to land, if I can say that. And the communities that were affected by some sort of water deluge from the storm would also now have to contend with sharks being dropped off by a tornado. So yeah, that movie was crazy. I think there were many more tornado shock movies, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I remember seeing these things at a very young age. Yeah, it was funny. It was really, really funny. Illogical, but just dumb fun. Yeah. The People's Crusade.
First, there's the group from France under a fellow named Walter Sannevoix.
Hold on. People's Crusade. Let's see here. Walter Sons of War. Okay.
Sannevoix. They left ahead of Peter and made it through Hungary all right, but when they showed up at Belgrade, the doorstep of the Byzantine Empire, the local governor was very confused. He'd been told that the Crusaders weren't supposed to show up for another half a year at least, and
this is the People's Crusade.
And weren't they supposed to be soldiers? This was just a mob led by a few impoverished knights. So, he didn't let them in. He told them he was going to send a letter back to Constantinople, and could they please just wait patiently until he got his instructions in order? How did they respond? By pillaging the countryside. In all fairness to the Crusaders, they were probably starving. They hadn't thought to bring many supplies with them, and you've got to remember, this is spring in medieval Europe.
No, I'm not going to understand their plight. I'm not going to do that. These people are adults. They are adults. They come from rural areas where, they farm the land. They understand what it means, for the specific time or seasons where you're supposed to sow the land, plant the seeds, and then, of course, the time to harvest from the land. They understand that. They understand that 100%. They understand that if they don't do this at a certain time, then later down the year, they're not going to be able to feed themselves. They understand that. These are adults. So their actions here in pillaging, the countryside of Belgrade, it is completely wrong. And I'm not going to, try to understand their plight. They understood what it meant when they traveled with this Walter, son of War, all the way down here to Belgrade, without any water, without any food. No. For sure, Walter also said, God will protect us on our way to Jerusalem. Yeah, probably said something like that, and they believed him.
It's not like they had refrigeration and rapid transport. The bulk of the food for the year comes in during the fall harvest, which is exactly why Urban scheduled his crusade to start in the middle of August, so
Walter and Peter did not get the memo. They did not get the memo.
It could be easy to resupply as they went. But by springtime, there's just not very much food around, so it's unlikely the Crusaders had been able to really stock up on spare provisions on their trek through Hungary. So the Crusaders went on a pillaging spree. They destroyed homes and farms. They even came to blows with the local Byzantine garrison. Some of them even went back to Hungary, which they'd managed to cross through before without doing any harm, and tried to loot a local market. They tried, but the townsfolk kicked them out, and the local Byzantine garrison beat them down too. And soon, cowed, these first Crusaders were brought under escort to Constantinople. We'll catch up with them in a bit when Peter gets there. But first we should talk about the second splinter group of the People's Crusade, a group from Germany led by Count Emico of Leiningen.
Count Emico. Okay.
This count had heard of Peter's preachings and had gathered his own group to go crusade. They were to head off to the Holy Land from Germany, but, well, they only got a few miles before they seemed to decide that, the local Jews are a lot closer and less well-armed. And so they went from town to town through Germany, sacking their own cities, slaughtering the Jewish population, and stealing any money they might find.
These charlatans, Peter the Hermit, Walter, son of War, and Count Emico, they are taking advantage of the desperate, the needy, the ignorant. They've taken advantage of these people, and they are directing them to a conflict that is none of their business, really. Honestly, it's none of their business. This is something that the kings and the king's armies are supposed to be dealing with, not the peasants. You have your duties, you have your responsibilities on the lands that your lords or your vassals control. And now they've been turned into bandits. They're not crusaders. They are a mob of marauding mass murderers, destroying their own countrysides of their own Christian people and other people belonging to the kingdom, like those who belong to the Jewish faith. These are not crusaders. And these charlatans, Peter the Hermit, Walter son of War, and Count Emico, I need their heads on spikes as an example. But it seems to me that, the people who are responsible are not, arresting these charlatans and bringing them to book. And even the church is not arresting Peter the Hermit. Especially him. Especially him.
Now, this was opposed almost unilaterally by the Catholic Church. This wasn't at all what Urban had called for. Even if you argue he didn't care about Jews, there's no question he wanted the fighting out of Christendom at the very least. Not only did priests and monks preach against this sort of violence, but there are actually heroic stories of bishops opposing these marauding crusaders and trying to protect their local Jewish communities.
There's someone called Worms?
The Bishop of Speyer gave them his protection. The Bishop of Worms brought the local Jews to take refuge in his home and even tried to fortify the place. But the Christian crusaders attacked and stormed the bishop's house, slaughtering some 800 Jews hiding there. The Bishop of Mainz did the same, and even ordered the town barred against the crusaders. In fact, there, the local Jewish population even raised a great deal of gold to give Emico if he would just go away. But Emico took the bribe, and then attacked the city anyway. When word of the attack reached him, the bishop raised his personal guard and rushed to join forces with the governor's militia and a force of local burgesses, who had come out armed to defend the local Jewish population. After fierce...
It has to take a priest to fight against these bandits. A priest, and not the king of the Holy Roman Empire. Not the king of France, also dealing with these people who want to leave for a crusade.
Fighting, the locals drove the crusaders off, but the crusaders gathered more men, recruited some sympathetic or bribable townsfolk, and attacked again. This time, the defenders broke and fled. In the aftermath, thousands of Jews were slaughtered. Emico's band massacred their way through Germany until at last, they ended up at the Hungarian border. By this time, Peter and his crusade had already passed through Hungary. We'll talk about how their trip went next time. But when the King of Hungary saw Emico's marauding band, he decided that nope, he was having none of this, and refused to let them into his country. The Crusaders decided to force their way in anyway, and promptly laid siege to the Hungarian Christian city of Moson, where they were promptly defeated by the city garrison and slaughtered almost to a man.
Good. And make sure that Count Emico's head is on a spike. He needs to go. Also Peter the Hermit. Also Walter son of War. They gotta go. These three men hold ultimate responsibility for the actions of the people that they have, led down this path. They must be set as an example.
And thus, the First Crusade began. Join us next time to find out what happens to Peter's band of itinerant peasants, find out what the Pope and the nobles were doing all this time, and watch the First Crusade begin in earnest. Last we left off, Count Emico's disastrous crusade had been smashed in Hungary, and the French contingent of peasant crusaders had been escorted under guard to Constantinople. Now it's time we return to Peter and his main force of peasant crusaders in Cologne. By the time Peter was ready to depart Cologne, he had amassed some 40,000 followers.
40,000? My gosh.
Most of them were untrained and unarmed. A small handful of them were lesser knights. His host included women, children, and the elderly, and together they were gonna retake the Holy Land.
Sorry guys, I had a phone call. Okay, let's continue.
Force of peasant crusaders in Cologne. By the time Peter was ready to depart Cologne, he had amassed some 40,000 followers. Most of them were untrained and unarmed. A small handful of them were lesser knights. His host included women, children, and the elderly, and together they were gonna retake the Holy Land.
I feel sorry for the children. You know, they're being led by these adults to their deaths. You know, they could die from exhaustion, they could die from starvation, they could die from any sort of diseases or infection, or they could be killed by the forces that are, protecting the Byzantine Empire. You know, because these People's Crusade peasants or bandits, as I would call them, you know, they're going to start pillaging, you know, other places looking for food because they didn't prepare themselves for this long trek all the way down to Constantinople. So the children are going to be swept up in these idiotic adults and their actions in pillaging and destroying, other communities, you know, looking for food. And they are the ones who are going to suffer. They are the ones who are going to be suffering as, you know, the adults start fighting against the forces that are defending Belgrade or the Byzantine Empire. Like what Walter was doing with his forces, or what Count Emicho was doing with his forces as they were fighting against the forces that were defending Belgrade and the Byzantine Empire. So yeah, the children, they're really going to suffer from all of this.
They set off towards the end of April and made their way down to Hungary. This time, the King of Hungary was a little less interested in allowing crusaders through his lands, but in the end, he basically said to Peter, "Look, you guys can go through, but first you gotta swear that you're not gonna kill anybody or break my things." To which Peter, of course, agreed. All was going well until the crusade arrived at the very town that the French expedition had looted while waiting at the Byzantine border. Some of the peasant crusaders got into a dispute with a merchant over a pair of shoes. This dispute became a brawl. This brawl became a riot. The riot then escalated into a battle, which culminated in one of the crusading knights leading a band of followers to storm the citadel of the city. They then stole the city's food, killed 4,000 Hungarians, and then hightailed it for the Byzantine border before the Hungarian army could show up. But now, the poor beleaguered Byzantine governor in Belgrade suddenly had 40,000 hungry, riotous peasants on his doorstep. He had heard of their behavior in Hungary, so he brought in a mercenary force to help keep the peace. They were to make sure that the Crusaders crossed the Sava River in a slow, orderly fashion, so the Byzantines could keep track of them and make sure that bands of Crusaders weren't just wandering the countryside. But, of course, the Crusaders felt that they weren't crossing the river fast enough, so they decided that the best course of action was to attack the Byzantine troops they were ostensibly there to help.
What a mess this is. What a mess.
After routing or killing the smaller Byzantine force, they then went pillaging and looting through the country until they got to Belgrade, which they pillaged, looted, and set on fire. The Crusaders then began to loot and sack their way towards Niš, the provincial capital. But
And in all of this mess, where is Peter the Hermit? Is he not the leader of this band of bandits? Or crusaders? Where is he? That's why I'm saying I need these three individuals' heads on spikes. And I need all of these people to disperse. Return home. Because there's no crusade happening here. You guys are just fighting against other Christians, destroying other Christians' homes and infrastructure, you know, killing Christians. Oh yeah, but because the Pope Urban did say that, you know, as long as you take over Jerusalem, all of your past, criminal actions will be forgiven and you'll be able to go to heaven, essentially. Yeah.
our poor beleaguered Byzantine governor had been busy preparing the defenses of Niš while the ponderous Crusader army was on the march. He had called in as many troops as he could, and when the Crusader force got there, he met with Peter. He asked that Peter wait at Niš until a military escort could lead them to Constantinople.
No. If I was this governor, I would give them an ultimatum. either you disperse and return back to France or to the Holy Roman Empire, wherever you come from, disperse and return home, or we kill you on the spot. Because there's no way I'm going to take a chance and allow you people to get into the Byzantine Empire and then you start pillaging and destroying more, communities and say that your God has taken you down this path. No. Either you disperse or we kill you.
Peter agreed, but only on the condition that the governor feed his army while they wait. Now, 40,000 people is no small number to feed in medieval times, and soon the governor was faced with the choice of feeding the Crusaders or feeding his people. So the governor just told them to go, just head for Constantinople and leave him alone. But some of the German contingent decided to burn down a mill on their way out.
Of course they did.
Which then escalated, and soon the governor had to call in the troops he'd been gathering at Nice to suppress the out-of-hand Crusaders. He gave his troops instructions to take hostages rather than killing when possible. Peter made his way to the very back of his column to see if he and the governor could come to an agreement and maybe his crusade could be allowed to go on its way. But by now, the mob of Crusaders were really completely out of Peter's control. They had
You're not in control anymore, Peter. But I still want your head.
Attacked the city of Nice itself. The garrison turned them away, but the defeated Crusaders just got a bigger mob together and attacked the walls of the city again. This time, our beleaguered Byzantine commander had had enough. He told his men to attack the Crusaders before they destroyed the provincial capital. The Crusaders were, of course, no match for trained, armed, and armored troops, and were decimated. Or I guess you could say quartered. Peter fled to the hills and hid, but by the time what remained of his army found him, a quarter of it was missing. Their supplies and money had also disappeared during the rout, and so the bedraggled band of beggars dragged itself to Constantinople, hungry, tired, and broke.
They're still forcing themselves to get to Constantinople after everything. Wow. They have no shame. They have no shame at all.
There they met up with the French contingent that had left the west before them, and Peter, along with the leader of the French force, Walter Sonnevoix, were summoned by the emperor. Despite everything, the emperor counseled them to wait for the real force of knights, which the Pope had assured him was on its way. But if they really wanted to go attack the Turks, he wasn't going to stop him. He would find some boats to ferry them across the Bosphorus. Of course, despite the warnings, the Crusaders wanted to cross into enemy territory. So after 5 days of feeding 30,000 unexpected guests, the emperor assembled his boats and ferried them into Anatolia. Once across, they began to pillage town after town until they made it to Nicomedia. And remember, this was Byzantine territory a few short years ago. These are the very towns that Emperor Alexius had petitioned the Pope to help him get back. But beyond that, there is no question. These towns were Christian.
Now I'm wondering whether the people who live in Anatolia are going to accept rejoining into the Byzantine Empire after what has just occurred in terms of this crusade coming in, pillaging and destroying and killing anywhere and everywhere they come across a settlement or a fortified position, you know. Will they really want to go back to an emperor that has betrayed them like this by allowing these foreigners who claim to be Christian as well, you know, coming in there and fighting and killing their own people like this? No.
But that distinction seemed lost on the Crusaders, and so pillage and loot they did. But once they reached Nicomedia, a quarrel broke out and the army fractured. The French contingent of the army stayed under the ostensible leadership of Peter, but the German and Italian portions broke off and elected to follow a knight named Reynold instead.
Reynold. So we have... Wait, Count Emico's dead, right? Okay, let me just say here he's dead. So we have Peter the Hermit, Walter Sonnevoix, and Reynold. Yeah, People's Crusade.
From there, the two groups continued to pillage until they both ended up occupying the fortified coastal town of Civito. Peter urged them to hold up there until the main crusading force arrived, but by this point he had long since lost control. The two groups started making forays into the surrounding countryside, literally egging each other on. Each time one group would return from a raid, they'd boast and talk about how much braver they were, how much more they were doing for the cause, which would then inevitably lead to the other group doing something rasher, stupider, and more foolhardy to show how much braver they were and how much more they were doing for the cause. Peter, unable to control this, decided to leave the crusade and head back to Constantinople to ask for the emperor's help. But while he was heading back, the French forces decided that it would be a good idea to attack the local Turkish capital. They couldn't get through the walls, so instead they pillaged and butchered everything around it, with atrocities ranging from systematic massacre of civilians to children being tossed on a fire. They considered this a job well done, and headed back to the base with more than the usual amount of self-congratulation. The German contingent, not to be one-upped, then went out to capture a nearby castle. The garrison there was light, and the German crusaders were successful, but they forgot to check if the castle had any water stored up. Of course, the Turkish forces by this point had been mobilized, and they knew full well that the castle had no water reserves, and that the nearest well was way outside its walls. So the Turkish army pulled up and parked itself outside the castle. After a few days drinking the blood of donkeys and their own urine, the Crusaders surrendered. Upon surrender, the Turks demanded that the Crusaders either convert to Islam or be put to death.
No. No. They must be put to death. Why would you want people like this to convert to Islam? Why would you want these bandits who would kill their own people, own Christians, and you'd want them to join and become those of the Islamic faith? Why would you want that? Why would you want that? And just because they say yes to converting to Islam doesn't mean they'll be true Muslims. Doesn't mean that they will follow the Quran 100%. So why would you want these people to convert? No. They gotta die. All of them.
While many Crusaders refused to abandon their faith and were put to the sword, brave Sir Reynold, leader of the band, never a man to be outdone, surprised even the enemy commander when he not only offered to become a Muslim, but also offered to join the Turks and make war against the Christians if they'd spare his life.
Look at you, Reynold. Wow. Anything to survive, eh?
Meanwhile, word, probably intentionally spread by the Turks, filtered back to the French Crusaders that the German group had not only captured a castle, but actually captured the Turkish capital as well. An argument broke out in the camp. Some thought that they should wait for Peter to return, which he never would, while others thought that if they waited they'd miss out on all the good looting. Soon, the faction supporting looting won out, because of course it did, and every single remaining Crusader, about 20,000 of them, marched out of their base toward the capital, under the leadership of one Geoffrey Burrell.
Geoffrey Burrell. Okay.
About 3 miles from the Crusader base, in a narrow wooded valley, the full might of the Turkish forces lay in wait. The disorganized Crusaders, rushing up the road in an effort to make it to the capital in time for plunder, didn't even notice the trap. As a hail of arrows poured out of the woods, the Crusaders began to rout almost immediately. Turkish horsemen thundered out of the woods, chasing down the Crusaders almost to a man. Of the 40,000 peasant Crusaders who had left Western Europe, only 3,000, following their brave leader Geoffrey Burrell, managed to flee fast enough to escape. Those 3,000 managed to hole up in an old abandoned castle until the Byzantines came to rescue them.
Why? Why are you rescuing these people? These people who have pillaged and destroyed, many kingdoms in the Christian world. And now they've also pillaged and destroyed the towns and the cities in Anatolia. Why would you want to bring these people back? For what? I just don't understand.
So let's just review the Crusade scorecard so far. Hungarian citizens killed? Thousands. Byzantine citizens killed? Also thousands. German Jews killed? Again, thousands. Crusaders killed? Tens of thousands. Christians killed? Tens of thousands. Turks killed? A few, most of them civilians. Massive economic disruption to the Eastern Roman Empire? Check. Eastern Roman forces who the Crusaders were supposed to be helping attacked? Check. Potential allies in Muslim territory ransacked? Check. And Holy Lands retaken? 0. And thus, the First Crusade began. Join us next time to find out what the barons have been doing during these shenanigans. See how the better-equipped barons and princes fare against the Turks. And
so basically, this was just a starter. This was just a starter of the crusade. We're still going into the main course and then the dessert. Wow.
watch the First Crusade actually begin. Last we left off, the disastrous People's Crusade had met its end at the hand of the Seljuk Turks, and Peter, along with the few thousand remaining of those who joined him, were hiding out in Constantinople awaiting the arrival of the real Crusaders. Today, finally, that real crusade will begin. But before the First Crusade can begin in earnest, the Crusaders have to get to the Holy Land. And to do that, we have to recognize one very important point about the First Crusade that's often overlooked. The army of the First Crusade isn't actually one army at all. Rather, it's at least 5 separate armies led by 5 different men from 5 different parts of Europe. Each of them set out from 5 different starting points with the idea that they'd all meet up in Constantinople and move on to the Holy Land from there. The first army is that of Hugh of Vermandois.
Hugh of Vermandois? I would have said Vermandois. Okay, but it's Vermandois. Right. Must be French.
This was the smallest army, although arguably the noblest of the noble armies, as Hugh was the brother of the King of France, which was a bit awkward as the Pope had recently excommunicated King Philip I of France for adultery, but hey, why let fraternal excommunication get in the way of a good crusade?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Now, from Western Europe, there are basically 2 ways to get to Constantinople. Travel over land through Hungary, or head to Italy and travel by sea. Hugh chose the latter of these 2 options. Unfortunately, his tiny fleet was hit by a storm, and he lost a good number of his ships. But eventually, the Byzantines fished the remaining Crusaders out of the Adriatic and escorted them to Constantinople, where...
Man, the Byzantine Empire's soldiers are rescuing, these Crusaders from the ocean, or should I say from the seas. Like, the People's Crusade was also rescued by the Byzantine Empire, and now... Hugh and his forces are also being rescued. It's very funny.
Where Hugh promptly sent a message to the emperor that read, "Know, O king, that I am king of kings, and superior to all who are under the sky. You are now permitted to greet me on my arrival, and to receive me with magnificence, as befits my nobility."
Excuse me? Who the hell are you? Hugh? I think you better get off that high horse of yours. You're speaking to the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. You are his guest. You are not anywhere near important enough for you to come and proclaim that you are noble and the king must bow before you. In fact, it's the other way around. You are the one who should be bowing. Wow.
Needless to say, the emperor was not impressed. The second army on our list was
Godfrey de Bouillon. Okay.
Was that of Godfrey de Bouillon. He represented the German contingent of the Crusades and brought a sizable force from the Holy Roman Empire, which is only a little bit awkward as he had actually fought against the Pope when the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were duking it out, and in fact, he directly helped kick the Pope out of Rome, but hey, why let a few armed legions supporting the anti-Pope to kick the legitimate Pope out of Rome get in the way of a good crusade?
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
He and his brother, Baldwin, leaving from only about 200 miles south of where Peter's crusade set out, decided to take the same route that Peter did. But this time, when the King of Hungary saw a group of crusaders pulling up on his doorstep, he was like, no, 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 no. But after a lot of talking, the King of Hungary finally allowed Godfrey to pass through on the condition that Godfrey's brother Baldwin and his entire family stay as hostages. After making it through Hungary without a single looting, Godfrey planned to resupply at Belgrade, but wait, no, Peter had burnt that to the ground. Oops. Now, our poor beleaguered Byzantine governor must have been preparing himself for yet another round of terrible conflict with the Crusaders, but Godfrey's army, like a champ, managed to make it through to Constantinople with only a tiny, itty-bitty bit of pillaging.
Tiny, itty-bitty. Alright. Beaumont, okay, of Taranto. Okay.
Next, we have the army of Bohemond, Prince of Taranto. The force he brought was smaller than most of the others, but it was by far the best armed and the most experienced, which is a little bit awkward because most of these troops got their experience trying to conquer the Byzantine Empire 12 years before. But why let unprovoked acts of naked aggression and the near unseating of the very ruler you're now supposed to go help get in the way of a good crusade?
Yeah, like I said, enemy of my enemy.
So, after sailing across the Adriatic and a ponderously slow march across the Balkans, where their men occasionally wholesale looted the very same people they looted a decade and a half ago in the war, Bohemond and his nephew Tancred finally made it to Constantinople. After Bohemond, we have the army of Raymond, the Count of Toulouse. Raymond...
Okay, Raymond...
very same people they looted a decade and a half ago in the war, Bohemond and his nephew Tancred finally made it to Constantinople. After
There we go. Toulouse.
Bohemond, we have the army of Raymond, the Count of Toulouse. Raymond led the largest army and what can be considered the principal crusading force. As such, Raymond considered himself to be leader of the crusade, which is only a little awkward as he traveled alongside Bishop Adhemar, the papal legate assigned by the Pope as the leader of the crusade.
Yeah, I remember you from the first episode, Bishop Adhemar.
But Raymond was also old, missing one eye, and stated that he hoped to die in the Holy Land, so why let a little leadership dispute get in the way of a good crusade? Raymond and his forces chose to follow the overland route to Constantinople. Unfortunately, when they got to the Balkans, they ended up passing through a lot of the same territory that Bohemond did, which meant that the people there were hostile, and the land was already stripped bare. This left Raymond's gigantic force hungry and grumpy, and by this point, we all know what hungry, grumpy crusaders do.
Yeah, pillage, pillage, and destroy.
During the pillaging, Bishop Adhemar was wounded and had to stay behind for a bit to recover. What's more, Raymond was called off to Constantinople to meet with the emperor personally, leaving no one really in charge of the largest crusading army.
They're just going to continue pillaging.
This huge unsupervised army then managed to get itself in a tussle with Byzantine forces, and, as is the pattern, got itself routed. But eventually, Raymond's remaining men limped their way to Constantinople. Lastly, we have the army of Robert...
Okay, Robert... Fallanders, okay.
Of Flanders, who surprisingly had nothing awkward going on at all, as his father had gone on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem a few years back, and had fought for Alexius Comnenus on the way, leaving the family on good terms with the Byzantines. Like Bohemond and Hugh, Robert also decided to try his hand at the sea route, and surprisingly, he managed to make the crossing to Byzantine territory without losses. Even more surprisingly, he managed to make it all the way to Constantinople without any major reports of pillaging or looting.
Well done.
But there were two other fellows leading this crusading army along with Robert. One Robert of Normandy, just to make things...
Robert of Normandy, okay. And Robert of Flanders.
It's confusing, and a Stephen of Blois, both of whom...
Stephen of Blois. 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 Okay. I.S.
were relations of William the Conqueror. They decided that the crossing was too risky and that they were going to wait until spring to cross. That would generally be a wise decision, though in this case they would end up losing one of their ships where Robert had lost none. And while they waited in Italy, a fair number of crusaders decided that a winter in Italy isn't what they signed up for, and deserted. Alright, I think that's everybody. Now that all the crusaders are in Constantinople, the real party starts. At least for the leaders of the crusade it does. You see, Alexius Comnenus, being a savvy guy, basically trusted none of these people. So he decided that before he'd ferry them across the Bosphorus, he'd get all the leaders to swear that as they crusaded, they would return any previously Byzantine territory they conquered to the Byzantine Empire.
Oh, does he suspect that they would cut out a piece from Anatolia and make it their own small kingdom? Ah, okay. That's understandable, but I don't know if an oath really is going to prevent them from doing what they want. Honestly. But let's see.
It's the entire reason Alexius got this ball rolling in the first place, after all. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with some of the crusading leaders, so Alexius decided to talk to them privately, one by one. It turned out that Hugh, in this as in most things, was a bit of a pushover. Godfrey, on the other hand, turned out to be absolutely bonkers. He just straight up refused to go to the Imperial Palace to meet with Alexius at all. So far as I can tell, he didn't really give any reason for this either. He had come all the way to Constantinople, and now he just sat outside doing nothing. Emperor Alexius finally decided, okay, I'll send Hugh to talk to him, I guess. But when Hugh showed up, Godfrey called him a lackey and refused to deal with anyone less than the emperor.
If you want to deal with the emperor, go to the emperor then. He has invited you to the palace to discuss with him. So, okay, maybe Godfrey wants to play some sort of game. You know, the game of political intrigue and court intrigue, and try to cut out a deal of some sort. But he's not playing it right. He's not playing the game right.
Okay. This weird standoff continued until, finally, after Alexius cut off the supplies he'd been sending him, Godfrey's troops attacked Imperial troops. There was a minor skirmish, Godfrey's troops lost, and so far as I can discern, Godfrey just instantly caved. The Emperor gave Godfrey a small mound of treasure and basically just said, "Get out of here," and booted his forces over the Bosphorus. Okay, that's 2 down. Now it was Bohemond's turn, and he was a wily one. Now, whatever else you may say about Bohemond, he was charming, intelligent, diplomatic, and shrewd. Alexius knew that Bohemond probably wasn't there just out of crusading zeal, as this was the same Bohemond who had tried to dethrone him a few years ago. Alexius was bracing himself for an argument to get Bohemond to agree to give back whatever conquests he might gain on the crusade. But Bohemond was one step ahead. He agreed right away. Of course he would take the oath. But since he was being so forthcoming, wouldn't it make sense for the Emperor to name him as the leader of the crusade?
Isn't the leader of the crusade Bishop Adama?
What? Alexius stumbled for a moment here, but he too was a savvy and shrewd man, and so rapidly regained his bearing, said something non-committal like, yeah, I probably could, hang on. And then quickly shuffled Bohemond off to a room literally overflowing with gold and jewels and silver, and basically said, "What? Look at all this annoying treasure just clogging up my otherwise lovely room. Wow, that's a nuisance. If only I had a buddy here who could cart it all off for me after saying one measly little oath." And measly little oaths were indeed said.
Yeah, money works 100% of the time, or maybe 99% of the time, but still, he can go back on this oath. But what choice does Alexius really have?
But this whole time, Bohemond's nephew Tancred was outside with the army, miles from the city, and so managed to just sort of never take the oath himself. This may end up being relevant to future Extra History episodes. Raymond was next. He met with the Emperor but flat out refused to take the oath. He went on a whole spiel saying God is my only leader and that he would not swear to such a thing.
Show him money.
Eventually, Alexius managed to get him to at least swear to an oath of brohood, a broth, if you will, proclaiming that Alexius was his bro forever and that he would help him wherever he could, especially against that weasel Bohemond. Alexius eventually said, "All right, good enough," and sent him on his way. No presents for you, though. Presents are for people who swear actual oaths. Lastly, of course, there was Robert. Their conversation boiled down to, "Are we cool?" "Yeah, we're cool." Then Alexius showered him with gifts and said, "Go get him, Tiger." And thus began the First Crusade.
Wow. After the People's Crusade, after all of the gathering of forces and, traveling down all the way down to Constantinople, after everything that has happened, now the Crusade is starting. Wow.
Seriously this time, the First Crusade is actually beginning now. Next week, we'll see them march off into Turkish territory, fight battles against people who aren't supposed to be their allies, and actually retake land for Christendom. See you then. So, at last, the crusade sailed across the Bosphorus. All 5 of the crusading armies, and the remnants of the Peasants' Crusade, joining into one massive force to retake the Holy Land. The Crusaders finally passed out of Christian territory. They weren't on Allied ground anymore. For once, any damage they did would actually be to the enemy they were summoned to fight. The First Crusade really had begun. But as the ships crossed the Bosphorus and disgorged their cargo of men in mail and plate, of giant destriers barded for war, of crossbowmen counting their quarrels, they were met with a silent, empty plain. One after another, the Crusader forces arrived, and they waited.
It's a trap. It's some sort of trap.
Anatolia was quiet. Too quiet. No Turkish horde came to sweep them back into the Bosphorus. No Saracen riders came to pour waves of arrows down on their crusading band. And so the princes met, discussed, and decided that they would move their forces to Nicaea, a few days' march away.
Nicaea. Okay.
With Godfrey de Bouillon at the head of the band. Nicaea was an important city. It was strategically important. It held the road to Jerusalem. If they couldn't take it, they'd have to march a much more difficult path with an incredible enemy stronghold at their back. Nicaea was also symbolically important. The First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea, had once been called there by the Emperor Constantine himself to determine what was orthodox for the Christian world. And it was politically important. When Kilij Arslan took over the Sultanate of Rum, he took Nicaea for his capital. It housed the royal treasury and the family of the Sultan. So the crusading forces marched on Nicaea. Godfrey and Bohemond and Tancred arrived first, followed by Raymond and Robert of Flanders. One by one, they set up the siege. And still, nothing happened. Still no Turks. This was getting weird. So, in the eerie quiet, the Crusader army broke into its component parts again, and each army took a section of the high, ancient Roman walls to lay siege to. Godfrey took the north. Bohemond and Tancred set up around the east. Raymond was still dawdling towards Nicaea, but the other two figured he could hold the southern wall when he got there.
And then what about the side of the wall that's towards the... Is it a lake or the ocean?
As for the west, well, one of the key features of Nicaea is that it sits on the lake Ascania.
Okay, Lake Ascania, alright.
This is no small lake, it's about 115 square miles. The western wall of Nicaea abuts the lake itself, so the Crusaders figured, well, we don't really need to guard that. And
are you sure? But that means they'll have to cut down trees and make boats, and that will take months. Yeah, okay, alright.
Thus, the Crusaders set up around the walls of Nicaea and promptly began to starve. But Bohemond, a seasoned military man, set up a system of naval resupply with the Byzantines. With that handled, the real work of sitting around could get started. Just as Raymond finally dawdled into place, the Turks at last arrived. Kilij Arslan at the head of about...
Kilij Arslan, right?
10,000 horse archers thundered down in the plain surrounding the city. Then he saw just how many Crusaders he was facing, and turned right around and thundered off in the other direction. The Crusaders...
Oh, okay. Well, this is not going to be like Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. It's not going to be like the Riders of Rohan coming in there. Death! 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 You know? Yeah. Oh well.
Crusaders gave chase with their heavy steeds, but as the Turkish horses were faster, the Crusaders inflicted only light casualties on Kilij Arslan's force. Still, they had routed them. The Crusaders celebrated. They held the field, and morale was lifted. It was time to get back to the siege. Now, each of the crusading forces had a different idea on how the siege should go. Some were trying to wait it out. Others were building siege engines. Others were digging under the walls, but none of this seemed to have much effect. Finally, it dawned on them that the western wall on the lake was a little more important than maybe they had first thought. Turns out, the garrison at Nicaea was secretly getting resupplied by boats coming over the lake at night. That kinda threw a wrench in this whole siege plan. The Crusaders didn't have enough forces to guard the entire coast of that enormous lake, and they didn't have a navy of their own to stop the resupply either. But if they didn't somehow prevent supplies from getting into the city, the defenders could practically hold out forever.
Yeah, looks like they're going to have to cut down the forests that are near the city and make boats. Yeah, or some sort of rafts.
So what do? Well, in a feat of logistics that could only be achieved by the heirs of Rome, the Byzantines came to the rescue. They sailed a group of ships to the harbor at Kivito, hauled them out of the water, put them on rollers, and dragged them to Nicaea.
Wow. Alright, that is far better than what I was thinking. That is far better than what I was thinking. That can work.
The next day, with as much fanfare as possible, the Byzantine ships began an assault from the lake, while the Crusaders assaulted the walls of the city from the shore. And soon, with their resupply cut off and their reinforcements driven back, the people of Nicaea offered to surrender. But here's where it gets complicated, because who do you surrender to?
You surrender to the leader of the crusade, and that's Beaumont of Taranto, yes.
There were basically 5 crusading armies and the Byzantines surrounding the city. To make it even more complicated, the garrison in the city, the only guys with weapons, were all Muslim Turks, while the population of the city, who vastly outnumbered them, were Orthodox Christians who used to be part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Oh, and not to mention the fact that the Sultan's wife and family were still in the city, as was the Sultan's treasury. So the negotiations began. But as the Crusaders were negotiating, they were also periodically assaulting the city. During one of those assaults, somehow, magically, the 2,000 Byzantine troops scaled the walls and captured the city, a feat which tens of thousands of Crusaders hadn't been able to achieve. That might seem like an incredible military feat, but remember, this is Emperor Alexius Komnenos we're talking about, and he was always a crafty guy. He knew that if the Crusaders got a hold of Nicaea, they would loot it until it burned to the ground, and then maybe not even give it back to him afterwards. That would not do. So, he had secretly made a deal with basically everybody inside the city to just let him take it. He let the Turks go free, he ensured the safety of the Sultan's family, he brought the people of Nicaea back into the imperial fold, and promised them protection from ransacking.
That's good, because really, if the other Crusader forces did take over the city, Nicaea would be a pile of rubble, and a lot of people are just going to be dead. And I think Nicaea is one of the jewels in the crown of Anatolia, if I can say that, because it's not just Constantinople, which is the great city of the Byzantine Empire. I'm sure there were other major powerful cities and economic centers on the land of Anatolia. Yeah. So it's good on Alexius for making this plan and for executing it as fast as possible, because definitely either the Crusader forces were going to destroy the city or they were going to claim it for themselves, because I'm still not really convinced that this oath that they've given to the king is really going to be enough. Yeah.
In return, they just sort of let his troops over the walls. Once the city was firmly in his hands, he let the Crusaders in small groups, and always under guard. But he tried to placate the Crusaders with gifts, to varying degrees of effect. He also tried to get them to reaffirm their oath to him to return Byzantine territory, also with varying degrees of effect. And so the Byzantines remained garrisoned in Nicaea, and the Crusaders prepared to press on. But hang on, what exactly was going on with the Turks this whole time? Why hadn't they showed up until it was too late? Where was Kilij Arslan the whole time the crusade was marching on Nicaea? Well, have I got a surprise twist for you. I bet you thought this whole time that whole Peasants' Crusade thing was useless, perhaps even more than useless. Well, ha! Turns out, by dying so pathetically in such large numbers so quickly, they had convinced Kilij Arslan that the crusading forces were not worth worrying about. And so, by heroically being
he only knew about the peasants, or should I say the People's Crusade, and he did not know about the kings, or should I say the kingdoms, contributing to this crusade. All right.
Such utter and unmitigated failures.
You would think that they would have some sort of spy network or information gathering network that works in the Christian world, where they can gather information and assess what's going on in Constantinople, and then that information is relayed back to the Turks, where then they would discover that, okay, no, the People's Crusade was not an actual crusade. The real crusade is still coming. Yeah, I'm quite surprised that they didn't have any spies or people who are focused on information gathering in the city of Constantinople.
The Peasants' Crusade had lulled the Sultan into thinking he had far more pressing things to deal with than these silly French people who kept showing up on his shores. Like medieval Europe, the Islamic states were also always involved in minor wars against one another, and the Sunni-Shia split led some in Europe to believe that the Muslim sects were more likely to ally with the Crusaders against one another than actually band together to fight. And when the Crusaders had landed, Kilij Arslan had been off in the eastern part of his realm dealing with border disputes from one of the other Islamic states. He had actually been informed of the Crusaders landing almost immediately, but he figured they'd probably bumble themselves to death before he'd even get there, and that his garrisons could deal with whatever trouble they might create anyway. In one of the great ironies of history, if the Peasants' Crusade hadn't expired en masse without doing any real damage, the Princes' Crusade might have been swept back into the sea before it ever had a chance to group up and gather steam. But gather it had, and now the Crusade began to head south. But finding supply too difficult to manage, they split again into two forces. A smaller force led by Bohemond and Tancred in the vanguard, and a larger force with Godfrey, Raymond, Stephen, and Hugh behind. After about 4 days' march, as dawn broke and Bohemond's forces began to wake in a small valley outside Derelium, Turks started to pour out of the surrounding hills. Kilij Arslan was not done yet. The Turks whirled in and out of the camp, slaughtering civilians and unarmored combatants. Individual knights tried to arm and mount amidst the chaos. Those who could tried heroically but futilely, often alone or in small gathered groups, to charge the fluid Turkish line. At last, Bohemond, riding furiously up and down the camp, shouted to his knights to dismount, lock shields, and defend the civilians. They formed a circle and tried to bring those without protection inside.
They are going with civilians? Must be people who are carrying or transporting their food, their water, and other sorts of equipment and resources. Okay.
The Turks rained arrows down on the knights in an unending stream, and yet they stood, stolid and unmoving. In one of the most impressive acts of discipline in all of the Crusades, the knights held their line, for hours, never being baited into charging, never breaking formation as men fell from the deadly hail. Inside the circle, people screamed as stray arrows made it over the wall of armor and shields and occasionally found their mark. Then the priests inside the circle began to sing, and those nearby began to sing with them. And the sun rose, and the men still held, battered by such mortal rain, baking in the heat of Anatolia, wearing full mail armor under the blistering sun. Then the women began to bring water to the line of knights, risky though it was to try. And still the knights did one of the most difficult things for any army in any time. Simply take fire for hours without moving, without breaking, without ever being able to attack back at their foe.
You see, now this is something I want to hear. Where these forces are defending civilians, they're defending them to death instead of pillaging and destroying and causing a muck and havoc across all of Europe and now entering into the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah.
And the line held. Slowly throughout the day, small forces of crusaders arrived. Godfrey, with some 50 knights, abandoned his main force and cut his way to the embattled Bohemond, as did men of Hugh's forces. Then, at last, after 7 straight hours of sun and arrows, Raymond's force arrived and slammed into the Turkish flank, surprising them completely. As he did so, Bohemond and Godfrey ordered the men to remount, abandon the shield wall, and charge the Turkish line, with a mighty cry of, "Today, if God's willing, we'll all be rich!"
Okay.
Completely serious. That was the battle cry, just a bit more Latin. Reeling, Kilij Arslan pulled back to a hilltop to defend. The fighting was fierce until at last, a force led by Bishop Adhemar of all people, snuck around behind the Turks, burned their camp, and charged them from the rear. The Turkish line fell apart, and the way to Antioch was left open to the exhausted crusaders.
What I find quite interesting is that the priests during the Middle Ages were also fighters. They're not just people who pray at in churches or pray for the soldiers to fight on the battlefields, but they also carry weapons, fighting against those who are against their faith. It's very interesting.
Join us next time for the March to Antioch, the trials of the desert, and a liberal interpretation of the meaning of oaths.
They're like battle priests. Bishop Adhemar is like a battle priest or something. Yeah.
After the Battle of Derelium, the way lay open to the south, towards Antioch, towards Jerusalem. But
Antioch is another city or another region? O-C-H. Okay.
The Turks, though beaten, were far from broken. In their retreat, they stripped the land and laid waste to anything they couldn't
I like how he's rolling the grass. Oh, that's fun.
take with them. And as the crusade moved south, the heat intensified. Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, had ordered the wells along the path destroyed, and in the sun-scorched plains of Anatolia, thirst began to stalk the ranks of the crusade. Parched animals laid by the roadside to die. Men chewed thorns for moisture. The crusade left a trail of the dead. But finally the crusade crossed into the fertile valleys of Iconium, where they restocked and made the trek across to Heraclea. Here the Council of Princes met to discuss their next move. Two paths lay open to them. One dangerous but quicker through the Taurus Mountains, and the other a slower but less risky path over the confusingly named Anti-Taurus Mountains.
Wow, Anti-Taurus Mountains. Why is it called that?
The majority of the army chose to follow the safer route, but Tancred and Baldwin set out on the harder trek.
Adventure time.
Tancred brought a few hundred knights with him, while Baldwin detached over 2,000 soldiers from his brother Godfrey's army for the adventure. Tancred's group set off first, and soon came upon the port town of Tarsus. After quickly driving the garrison back into the city, he realized he had a problem. He had nowhere near enough men to take a walled city like Tarsus, so Tancred sent word back to his uncle Bohemond to send along reinforcement. But as the writer was heading back to the main force with the message, Tancred had a flash of brilliance. He quickly had his men surround the town and make it look like they were preparing for a siege. Then he sent word to the Turkish garrison that he was but the vanguard of an enormous force of crusaders who would soon sweep over Tarsus and do horrible things to any Turks defending its walls. Most of the Turkish garrison quietly snuck out of the town that night. The rest offered to surrender in the morning. Now, you remember a couple episodes ago how Tancred had managed to slip through Constantinople without swearing an oath to the
Yeah, I remember.
Byzantine emperor? Well, the garrison flew Tancred's banner over the town, and he declared it his city. This lasted all of about 15 minutes before Baldwin arrived. Baldwin, who was much less concerned with subtlety, and apparently oaths, saw the banner and basically said, "Hey, what a fabulous idea. I love it. But I have 2,000 men, so why don't you let me have that city instead?" Tancred grumbled under his breath about how he had both beaten back the garrison and tricked them into abandoning the city, but he couldn't really fault Baldwin's logic. 2,000 was indeed more than a few hundred. So he packed up his camp and grumpily started to head east. With Tancred gone, Baldwin's banner now flew over the city. But guess who shows up? The reinforcements Tancred had sent for before coming up with that ruse to take the city. Now, these men must have been a little miffed to have trekked all that way for nothing, but Baldwin, never a very secure man, and never one to miss an opportunity to add insult to injury, refused to even let them into the city for the night, instead forcing them to take camp outside the city walls. Then, to add real injury to insult to injury, remember how the Turkish garrison had slipped out in the middle of the night? Well, they were still out there, and in the middle of the night, they descended on the Crusaders camped outside the walls and slaughtered them as they slept. Those Turks really got a lot done at the middle of the night. Bunch of night owls. As you can imagine, when the town woke up and saw a few hundred dead crusaders outside, well, no one was very happy with Baldwin. In response,
You have to take responsibility, Baldwin. This was your decision. Kicking them out or keeping them out of the city has resulted in their deaths. Yeah.
he heroically locked himself in a building and refused to come out until people calmed down. Tancred, meanwhile, was off conquering the next town. This time, though, when Baldwin caught up and arrived outside the walls, things went a little differently. Tancred had augmented his force with local Armenian volunteers, and by the time Baldwin showed up at this new city, Tancred was well entrenched inside the city walls. So, when Baldwin asked to be let in, it was Tancred's turn to say, "Nah, I think you get to sleep outside." But, not content with letting Baldwin get off so lightly after letting their compatriots die, some of Tancred's knights ended up charging Baldwin's camp, and the Crusaders started a brawl outside the newly conquered city. And then, Baldwin basically wandered off and abandoned the crusade. Baldwin headed east. He met an heirless king. He got the heirless king to adopt him. He promptly...
What? Why would the heirless king adopt someone he doesn't even know? Why doesn't he adopt someone from his community to become his heir? But he's adopting some nobody.
let the heirless king be assassinated. He ordered the man who introduced him to said king, who was theoretically his friend, to be tortured to death, and he declared himself Count of Edessa.
Well done. Well done. Baldwin, well done. You played the game, you played it so well, and you won. Yeah, now you're the Count of Edessa. I don't understand that Airless King. Why didn't he just adopt someone from, his own kingdom or his own territories instead of adopting some nobody? Really? Huh? Well done.
And thus, the first Crusader state is born. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, Edessa had once been part of the Byzantine Empire. Yes, Baldwin had sworn the oath. And no, he was not going to give it back. And not to spoil future series, but he ends up becoming King of Jerusalem. Anyway, Tancred, meanwhile, rejoined the main crusade, and captured a few more towns relevant to the effort along the way. When he rejoined, though, the crusade was a bit worse for wear. Mail armor and mountain climbing don't mix, and the safer road through the Antioch Mountains had only proven to be slightly safer. At this point, they'd lost most of their horses to the heat, and abandoned much of their armor in the mountains. And in front of them stood the great and ancient city of Antioch. A city founded under Alexander, made great by Rome, and fortified by Justinian. It was the last great obstacle between the Crusaders and Jerusalem. But the massive walls constructed by Justinian were too much for the Crusaders. The walls, which flew off from the city like wings high into the mountains, made the city impossible to encircle.
Man, why is Antioch so important like this? Like, what does it have? What type of strategic value does it have? Is it like a trade center? Or are there resources that are being mined in the area? Wow. To think that in these different eras, starting from the Greeks, the Romans, and Justinian, his reign over the Byzantine Empire, this place has been modified and upgraded, and it's become a very powerful fortress. Huh. Wow.
Massive stones and impressive towers Justinian's men had built were more than these Crusaders could breach. So the Crusaders decided on a plan, albeit one of the oddest siege plans I've ever heard of. They were going to have contingents blockade most but not quite all of the city's gates, which would seem to defeat the point of a siege, but some of those gates lay high atop the nearby mountains, and others lay behind a river which would split the Crusaders' forces, so the Crusaders decided to simply block what gates they could and wait. But as the weeks and then months passed and fall turned into winter, the crusade began to starve. The local area was stripped bare, so any foraging party would have to go far afield and risk being ambushed if they were to resupply the army. So the princes decided on a daring plan. Bohemond and Robert of Flanders would take a sizable part of the army with them to forage in force, while the remnants of the Crusader army would try to maintain the siege. So Robert and Bohemond headed off, but as their foraging party reached the tiny village of Albara, what did they see? A large Muslim army marching down the very road to Antioch they were heading up to forage. The Muslim force was as surprised as the Crusaders, and after a few minutes of everyone just blinking at each other in shock, the Crusaders, though outnumbered and laden with forage, charged. When the dust cleared, many were dead on both sides. There was no clear victor, and the Crusaders had lost all the forage they'd set out to acquire. But, in one of the strange twists of luck that accompanied the First Crusade, the commander of the relieving Muslim force, who was never that into being a relieving force, looked at the casualty list and decided, well, so much for that, and packed up his army and went home. Antioch.
Wow. Really, the disorganization and lack of loyalty on the side of the Turks is just killing them. It's killing them. Any chance for them to regain these important strongholds like Nicaea and now even Antioch, which is going to become under threat, they're not going to get them. They're not going to, get them back again, maybe. Wow.
The reinforcements were gone. The Crusaders were still starving, though, and that's not all. There were earthquakes and comets, even auroras, and Crusaders were generally the superstitious type, so after
earthquake, comets, and an aurora on the same day? Or was this happening in a duration of days or weeks or months? An aurora happening all the way so far down south from the North Pole. Must have been like a huge solar flare coming from the sun, and it affected the ionosphere of Earth. Wow. All right.
Seeing all that, a lot of them began to slink off and abandon the crusade, including none other than Peter the Hermit. Bishop Adhemar quickly hauled some of these recalcitrant crusaders back to Antioch, including Peter, and then followed up with a brilliant plan. He called for a fast to regain the favor of God, which is a pretty clever way to improve morale and solve your supply problems. At long last, and much worse for wear, the Crusaders made it through to spring, and the food situation started to improve. And then Bohemond got tricky. He convinced the leader of the Byzantine contingent that there was a plot to kill him. When the Byzantines reacted by going back to Constantinople, Bohemond accused them of cowardice and abandonment, treacherous behavior which he claimed freed him of his oath to Emperor Komnenos.
And like that, it's over. Well done, Bohemond.
Now, with another Turkish reinforcing army bearing down on the crusade, he threatened to abandon the siege of Antioch unless he was allowed to keep the city when they took it. Godfrey and Raymond grumbled about this, but there was only so much they could do, as the lesser knights loved Bohemond. You have to give Bohemond some credit, though, because after this, he proceeded to lay out and execute a plan that not only thrashed the Second Turkish Relief Army headed for Antioch, but also inflicted a great number of casualties on the garrison. And thus the siege survived to drag on into summer. Then the Turks assembled a third great army to relieve Antioch, this one far too large for the Crusaders to meet in open battle. But Bohemond hadn't spent the months idly. He managed to find a guard commander in the city who was bribable, and just before the arrival of the Turkish army, the bribed commander let the Crusaders over the walls in the dead of night. The massacre was horrific and indiscriminate, but by dawn, with many civilians amongst the dead, the Crusaders had captured all of Antioch except the citadel, which stood atop a mountain at the end of its long walls.
I'm sure that officer who was bribed was also killed. You can't have those types of loose ends hanging around, because if you can bribe him, I'm sure the Turks are going to do the same thing. So yeah, probably that person who opened the gates to these Crusaders is also dead. But the civilians, like, why? What? They are Christians. The inhabitants of Antioch are Christians. Why are you killing them? Huh? Oh well.
Join us next time as the besiegers become the besieged, as we witness the epitome of horror, and as, at last, the Crusaders make it to Jerusalem. Last we left off, the Crusaders had just taken Antioch. Now they have to hold it. There's just a small series of problems. 1, the Turkish army bearing down on them has now surrounded Antioch. 2, the Turkish garrison in Antioch still holds the citadel, which is inside the city walls.
Hold on, guys. I want to check if the city of Antioch is still existing in our modern time. Or has it been destroyed and, just a pile of rubble now? I'm just wondering. Because really, this type of city that's been invested into by so many different empires over the eras that have passed by, it's quite interesting to hear about. Okay, but I think it's called under a different name now. Hold on. Okay, no, I see a lot of... One of the most important Greek cities of the Hellenistic period. It served as the capital of the Seleucid Empire and later as a regional capital to both the Roman and Byzantine Empire. Okay, during the Crusades, Antioch served as the capital of the Principality of Antioch, one of the 4 Crusader states. That were founded in the Levant. Its inhabitants were known as Antiochnes. The modern city of Antakya in Hatay province of Turkey was named after the ancient city, which lies in the ruins on the Ontoras River and did not overlap in habitation with the modern city. Okay. So Antioch is gone. It's just a ruin now. But then there's another city that's modern in our time period, if I can say that, that is adjacent to it. Okay. Yeah, that's a bit unfortunate. I'd want to see this, fortifications that's circle around Antioch. I'd really want to see, this type of investment that's been poured into this city by these different empires. But yeah, okay, interesting. Let's continue.
3. Antioch is almost out of food after that prolonged siege the Crusaders themselves put it under. 4. The day before they took Antioch, Stephen of Blois just decided that everything was hopeless and abandoned the crusade, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days. 5. To compound his desertion, on his way back, Stephen ran into the Byzantine relief army and told them all hope was lost. So the Byzantines were like, okay, and promptly turned around to defend their own territory. So there would be no Byzantine reinforcements arriving. But for 4 straight days, the Turks assaulted the walls, and for 4 days, the beleaguered Crusaders held. Bohemond desperately racing between containing the Turks in the citadel and trying to hold the wall. Godfrey rallying the troops. The Turks attacked in waves to keep their forces fresh, but there were already too few Crusaders to hold the great ramparts, and so they fought without relief. After 4 days of vicious combat, the Turks decided, you know what, let's just starve these guys out. So, once again, starvation set in, and Crusader morale began to drop. Things looked bleak, but then, a sign. An impoverished local mystic claimed to have had a vision of St. Andrew telling him where the lance of Longinus, the holy lance that supposedly pierced Christ's side, was buried.
In Antioch? Okay.
So the Crusaders started to dig a big hole in the floor of the Church of St. Peter in Antioch. The mystic jumped down into the pit, and lo and behold, he pulled out a hunk of iron. "We found it," he said, "the head of the lance of Longinus."
Wow. Okay. How do we know that it's really the genuine thing? Or you're just going to proclaim it is? Because, alright, you know what? Good luck.
Bohemond and Tancred were skeptical, and Bishop Adhemar was having none of it. They already had one of those holy lance things back in Rome, but the ordinary soldiers...
And how do we know that one is real too? Hey, wow. I'm sure there must have been a lot of these fake relics that have been, proclaimed to be holy and something that was once used by Jesus or being used against Jesus, like the lance of Longinus.
Were inspired. Raymond declared it a sign that they would prevail. 13 days later, with food running out, the gaunt and wild-eyed Crusaders rode out of the gates to attack the Turks. Carrying the lance of Longinus and with the fervor of men otherwise doomed, the Crusaders let out a great yell and charged the vastly superior Turkish force.
God wills it! God wills it!
6 columns of men, each led by one of the lords of the crusade, poured out of the city gates and slammed into the Turkish line. Later, soldiers would speak of having seen the saints riding amongst them, carrying banners of white and riding steeds like snow.
Nah, you guys were just starving, you were hallucinating, you have a lot of adrenaline pumping in your veins. Yeah, no, you didn't see any saints.
And with desperation they fought. The Turks lit a great fire to drive them back, but through flame and smoke they fought on, until at last...
And definitely in this flame and smoke, any horse riders that they saw passing by and going towards the enemy, they must have thought that those people were saints. Because maybe like the light reflecting on their armor, making them shine. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons onto why they are seeing saints. And nobody else on the battlefield is seeing saints. There's a lot of explanations and reasons why. These people were hungry. They were desperate, they were excited because they had this lance of Longinus beside them. And, there's a lot of smoke and fire across the battlefield. Yeah.
Last, against all odds, the Turkish line collapsed. The Crusaders fell upon the Turkish camp and the stores held there. The crusade had survived. Unbeknownst to the Crusaders, though, they'd had one advantage. While the Turkish host appeared to them to be one mighty army, it was actually, like the crusading force, made up of many smaller armies with their own commanders. And it turns out that many of those commanders would have rather seen the Crusaders keep Antioch than have it fall into the hands of their superior. So as soon as the battle began to turn, many of them used it as an excuse to just desert and flee. But
wow. Man, the Turks are not as united as we might think they should be. Especially under this type of threat. Because if the Crusaders continue to push, they will reach Jerusalem. They will take that prize, And, this type of political squabbling between the Turk vassals and lords and whoever else, really, it'll be at their detriment. But I guess their small-minded political machinations are more important to them than seeing the bigger picture. Yeah.
No matter the cause, the Crusaders had overcome the last great obstacle between them and Jerusalem. Now the crusade would be complete in no time, right? Not exactly. Raymond and Bohemond immediately began to dispute who would get to keep Antioch. Bohemond, always a little slyer than Raymond, eventually won out, after months and months of arguing while the crusade languished in Antioch. During that time, Hugh was sent off to talk to the Byzantine Empire about rejoining the crusade, but Hugh was never Alexius's favorite, and his pleas seemed to...
The guy was irritating. Hugh was irritating. From day one. From day one, when he was asking the emperor of the Byzantine Empire to come kneel before him, because he's the most noble of noble. Aye.
Have little impact. So what did Hugh do? Instead of returning to the crusade as originally planned, he basically said, "Well, I'm out. Peace," and wandered off back to Europe, for which he would be mocked for the rest of his days. And that's not all. During the months spent sitting around Antioch, a sickness passed through the camp, and Bishop Adhemar took ill and died, leaving the crusade as a whole functionally leaderless.
I mean, he wasn't really the leader. Honestly, he just wasn't. He was the face, yeah, but he wasn't really a leader. No. The leader is Bohemond. It's Bohemond. Bohemond is the leader. Okay, what is it? Bohemond of Taranto. Yes, he is the leader. Everybody else are being led by him.
At this point, Raymond, deciding that he possessed the Holy Lance and thus should be leader, started the crusade south again. This decision was in some ways precipitated by one of the grimmest moments in the crusade, the siege of the nearby city of Marat. After massacring the local population, while Bohemond and Raymond disputed who owned the place, the Crusaders were reduced to such a state of hunger that even the Western chroniclers talk in appalled tones about them roasting and boiling the dead Turks to eat.
My gosh. Ugh.
So, with only one major incident of cannibalism behind him, Raymond came to the conclusion that he had been ordained by God to lead the crusade south toward Jerusalem.
These people are having these imaginary dreams of God talking to them. It's so sad and funny at the same time, Any sort of excuse to pull these very dogmatic, faith-driven people to do your bidding. You could just say that I have been ordained by God to become the next king of France, and therefore I must kill the current king of France. I'm sure 40,000 people are going to follow you, so that you can accomplish this mission. Really. Huh.
And started trekking through the country. But only Tancred and Robert of Normandy agreed to follow. Jerusalem was in Shia hands at this point in time, so the crusade actually passed through most of the countryside without incident. The local Sunni population even helped supply them in the hopes that the Crusaders would both leave them alone and give the Shia a good kicking. But then Raymond decided that he needed to attack the town of Arca, which is pretty random as it had no bearing on them getting to Jerusalem. Of course, it would have some bearing if you were secretly planning to subvert the crusade in order to take over Tripoli and set up a kingdom of your own there, but...
Oh, another crusader state? Raymond?
We'll never know.
I thought you said you wanted to die in this crusade. I thought you said you were too old and I'm gonna die soon, so I want to die in this crusade. I guess that's now been chucked out of the window, huh? There's an opportunity now to become a king of a new empire.
Oh, if that was Raymond's true intention, because he utterly failed. In fact, he failed so spectacularly that Tancred and Robert left him to go join Godfrey, whom Raymond promptly asked for help. The combined Robert, Tancred, Godfrey army showed up, but it still wasn't enough to prosecute the siege, so the crusade just kinda stalled out again. Until a clergyman in Godfrey's army basically challenged the mystic who had found the Holy Lance to a monk duel, and the mystic agreed to undergo an ordeal by fire. Tragically, said mystic was not protected by God during the ordeal and burned to death, and the lance was discredited. Most of Raymond's credibility had come from possessing that lance, and now, since the lance was no longer a sacred object thanks to the clergy beatdown, Godfrey took over and said, Let's get back to going south toward Jerusalem, huh? So, without further incident, other than one moment where Tancred popped over to conquer Bethlehem just real quick, the Crusaders finally made it to Jerusalem. But by this point, the crusade was in tatters. Baldwin was up in Edessa doing his own thing. Hugh...
Yay! Hey, Baldwin.
had abandoned the crusade. Bohemond was holding down Antioch.
Yeah, Baldwin and Bohemond, those two, they are the successors in this entire crusade. Everybody else, I don't know.
The Byzantines were just done with the whole affair. Stephen had run off, and Ottomar was dead. There weren't really a lot of crusaders left to do the besieging. To add to this, the Fatimid forces holding the city had poisoned all the nearby wells, so the crusaders were also rapidly succumbing to thirst. The remaining princes decided they'd have to take Jerusalem by assault or not at all. There's no way they could maintain a siege. But there was still one other problem. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. There was no lumber to build siege towers or scaling ladders. Things looked pretty hopeless. But just then, a group of Genoese ships arrived at a nearby port and saved the day. The Genoese agreed to dismantle their ships and bring the timber as quickly as possible to Jerusalem.
Who are the Genoese? Oh, okay. Welcome, I guess.
The crusade wasn't over yet. The siege towers began to rise. On July 13th, 1099 CE, the assault on Jerusalem began. The Crusaders split into two forces, one led by Raymond, the other on the opposite side of the city led by Godfrey and Tancred. As Raymond's tower began to roll forward, it was battered and nearly destroyed. Raymond's assault had failed, but Godfrey and Tancred had been far more crafty. Like Raymond, they too had been erecting a siege tower on their side, and seeing this, the defenders had prepared their defenses all along the wall facing it. But unlike Raymond, the night before the assault, Godfrey and Tancred had disassembled and rebuilt their siege equipment in front of a totally different part of the wall. When the assault began, the section of the wall they attacked was completely unprepared. Still, the fighting swayed back and forth. For 2 days, the Crusaders assaulted the walls, and for 2 days they were held back. Raymond's tower was burnt to the ground, and many of the siege engines were smashed. But at last, Godfrey's tower reached the wall. Godfrey and Tancred were among the first to cross. The battle along the wall was hard fought. No grand strategy or clever maneuvers, just a desperate melee that resolved down to a few hundred instances of men locked in single combat. But in the end, the Crusaders won out and opened the city gates. Now, with forces pouring in from all sides, the Muslim defenders broke and fled into the city. Victorious, the Crusader army began the biggest massacre the Holy Land had ever seen. Men, women, and children were slain as they ran through the streets. The chroniclers describe Crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood through Jerusalem as they butchered all those they could find.
Like, why? I still don't understand the strategic value of killing civilians. They are not attacking you. So why are you killing them in droves? Like, I don't understand that notion. Where is the justification of that part? I understand fighting against the defenders of the city. You defeat them. Done. It's not like the civilians are going to fight against you. So why do that?
Only the youngest of the crusading princes, Tancred, tried to stop the slaughter, going so far as to give a group of Muslims his banner and telling them to show it to anybody who came for them to let them know that they were under his protection.
Okay. I don't know if that's really going to help. They'll just probably, accuse these Muslims of stealing it from you. But, yeah.
But even this was futile. Tancred was called off to attend to some other part of the fighting, and when he returned, those he'd offered protection to were dead upon the mosque floor. There would be one more battle outside of Jerusalem, but this was pretty much it. That's how the Crusaders retook the Holy Land. And thus, the First Crusade ended.
Yeah, the crusade began with blood and it ended with blood.
Hello everyone, welcome to Lies, the part of Extra History where I try to put right all the mistakes we've made.
I like your beard. I like how you've made it molded here at the bottom like this. Yeah, I really like that shape. I might try that. I might try that. I actually might try that.
Sort out what lies we told you, and tell you all the stories that just didn't make the cut for the show. First, I have to get this off my chest, because I've been waiting to say this since I wrote the first episode. This is the successful crusade. No other crusade in the Middle East will ever retake as much territory as the First Crusade. So as far as crusades go, this is the best it gets. Okay, so...
Yeah, I mean, like, they took a lot of fortifications and cities. They've went deep into Anatolia, taken over a lot of land and territory there, and headed all the way down into, Tripoli. They also passed down Antioch as well, yes. Tripoli and, all the other major cities like Bethlehem, and then, heading straight for Jerusalem. So yeah, they were really successful.
Now on to clearing a few things up. One of the things that struck me most when doing this was how different the conception of history was in the Middle Ages. Like in the classical period, the Greeks and the Romans, you've got historians who research, compare different accounts, and try and come to the most accurate picture of the past. Sure, they may exaggerate the number of people in a battle, but it's pretty solid history. Our modern idea of history comes directly from them, and it's their tradition we follow when we think about history to this day. But somewhere between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance, that tradition was lost, and instead you have chroniclers. And these guys had a very different view of history. They would write what they knew and sort of fill in the rest. And very often, they'd write what they felt should have happened from a biblical perspective or a storytelling perspective, rather than what really did happen. And as these were often written to aggrandize a king or intended to fit moral instruction for the church, there was some pretty major differences between what did happen and what should have happened. For example, right, in this story, did everyone really rise up and spontaneously shout, Deus Vult, to kick off the crusade? In my opinion, probably not.
Really? God wills it? I mean, that's such a very powerful statement right there. After the Pope has declared war against the Islamic world and to reclaim the Holy Land and the holy cities, God wills it. It just works. It just suits the entire mood of that entire speech by Pope Urban II. But okay.
But it's the first thing that anybody learns about the Crusade. Like seriously, any course you ever take about the Crusade, this is the first thing they'll tell you. It's all because I think only one, so far as I remember, chronicler, who wasn't even at the Council of Clermont, decided to put that fact in there. And for details like that, these small details, the Chronicles are actually the only source we have for this period. So whenever you're dealing with the Crusades, whether it's in school or in a book or here with us, that's our primary sources. Not exactly what you hope for, so just know that going in. Oh, and one more thing to clear up before we move on. Emico's terrible crusade of horribleness and the people's slightly less terrible crusade of only pretty badness happened at almost exactly the same time. And when I first tried writing this, I tried hopping back and forth between the two, but it killed the flow and made everything a lot more confusing. So I opted to start with Emico's crusade because it left while Peter was still gathering everyone to go wander off to the east. But something that on reflection might have gotten muddled a bit was the fact that Emico spent so long persecuting Jews that Peter actually beat him to Hungary. So when the King of Hungary smashes Emico's crusade, it's in part because he already had to deal with Peter and the People's Crusade. Oh, speaking of Emico, oh God, how do I do this? There's one really funny thing I have to say, and one really dark thing. Let's go with the funny one first. So, you know how the Crusade was supposed to be helping the Byzantines? Well, Emico told people that Christ really wanted him to march on Constantinople, and not actually the Holy Land, take over the city, declare him the last world emperor.
I knew it. I knew it. Remember when I just discussed this right now? About how you know, you could just say to a mass populace of people that God has spoken to me. He has anointed me to become the leader of an army that's going to take over a kingdom, and I would be its leader. And 40,000 people would follow you to death, you know, to achieve this goal. And now Emiko has done that. That's Emiko's plan. Wow.
And start the end times and fight the Antichrist. So yeah, so much for helping Constantinople. And as far as people who followed him, some of the people who believed him when he said this also worshipped a goose and believed it was inhabited by the Holy Spirit and that they were following it on crusade, not really Emiko.
Wow. A goose. Okay, these guys must be like, I don't know, sick in their head or something. I don't A goose.
So that's the quality of Emiko's troops. I don't really know how to transition to the next part, but the heavy bit. Emiko's campaign, as stupid and abortive as it was, is often seen actually as a turning point in anti-Semitism in Europe. While there had always been anti-Semitism, this is the first case of really large-scale organized violence against the Jewish community, and the anti-Jewish fervor that it whipped up is often cited as the root of some of the later anti-Semitic laws. This may leave you wondering, okay, so what happened to Emiko after all this?
I hope he's dead. I hope his head is on a spike. How I wish all those other people's crusade generals' heads were also on a spike. Because really, honestly, what they have done.
Well, he of course survived, promptly abandoned his sacred crusading vow, and went back home to live the rest of his life as if nothing happened.
Wow. Wow.
So there's that. But enough with Emiko. Let's talk crazy facts about everybody else. Hugh joined the crusade because he saw an eclipse. Raymond lost his eye on pilgrimage and kept the dried out husk in his pocket, supposedly for good.
Ew. Ew, man.
Good luck. Bohemond was totally Anna Komnena, the emperor's daughter, totally her teen crush, which makes things a little bit awkward as she provides us with the most reliable account of the Crusades of any of the contemporary sources, and only occasionally strays into passages describing Bohemond like, he was so tall in stature that he overlapped the tallest by nearly 1 cubit, narrow in waist and loins, with broad shoulders and a deep chest and powerful arms, and in the whole build of the body was neither too slender nor overweighted with flesh, but perfectly proportioned, and, one might say, built in conformity with the canon of Polycletus. His skin all over the body was white, and his face, the white was tempered with red. His hair was yellowish, but did not hang down to his waist like that of other barbarians, for the man was not inordinately vain of his hair, but had it cut short to the ears. Whether his beard was reddish or any other color, I cannot say, for the razor had passed over it very closely and left the surface smoother than chalk. His blue eyes indicated both a high spirit and dignity, and his nose, the nostrils breathed in the air freely. His chest corresponded to his nostrils, and by his nostrils, the breath of his chest.
Oof. Wow, lady. You're in love.
And speaking of Bohemond, remember the room that overflowed with treasure? Well, most of the accounts I've read, that's literally how they describe it. So I just imagine him turning the corner and just seeing gold pouring out to the hall. Oh.
Yeah, well, the Byzantine Empire was extremely rich. Very, very, very rich. You know, the past kings have really made sure that the Byzantine Empire had a tremendous amount of resources to outlast their, you know, tenure as a king or as an emperor onto the next generation of emperors of Byzantine. And yeah, it's no surprise, really.
And remember how Bohemond's nephew, Tancred, never took the oath to Alexius Komnenos to return territory? Well, he and Bohemond timed it so that way Tancred would actually arrive in Constantinople at night, and then he furiously rode through the city, so he'd be on a ship before dawn. So, no, they weren't trying to have him avoid that oath at all. Oh, next, broth, totally now a word. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about place names. I'm using the names for places that the Byzantines and Crusaders would have called them, because the Turkish names were actually harder to find in some cases, and probably wouldn't do us any favors on the pronunciation score. So if we ever look at these things from the other side, we will probably try to do this, but for right now, just know these are the Byzantine and Crusaders place names. Oh, and remember how Alexius ended up in possession of Nicaea and captured the Turkish Sultan's wife and children? He actually returned them safely to Kelij Aslan without even asking for ransom. So throughout all this, there were some people who were civilized. Which actually, now that I think about it, leads me to a couple of the patron voters questions. Luke Haynes and Sephardic wanted to know how much territory the Byzantines got back during the Crusades. And they actually got back most of Anatolia and some of the outlying lands. And Sephardic also wanted to know if the Crusades were good for the Byzantines in the end. And
I don't know. Does it look like it was, though?
that's a really complex question. The short-term answer is yes. The long-term answer is a pretty resounding no. But I'm not going to go into that anymore here, lest I spoil something that will someday certainly be another episode. And I want to talk about Baldwin becoming the Count of Edessa.
His story is just unbelievable. His story is unbelievable. Like, it's the stuff of telenovela stories that you watch on television, you know, the drama. Imagine some rich old guy adopts you. The friend who introduced you to this rich old guy, you kill him, and you kill your adoptive father, and you become the leader or the boss or the count of that old king's estate. Like, that's the stuff of TV drama. My gosh.
Alan and Johnny wanted to know about this as well, so here we go. I'm going to just give the short version off the top of my head, so forgive any lies and the lies, but remember when Baldwin just sort of wanders off and conquers another kingdom and kind of abandons the crusade? It's actually because one of his close advisors, a dude named Bagrat, convinced Baldwin that he should head to the east, into Armenia, because by now the crusade wasn't looking very good for Baldwin, and according to Bagrat, the local Christians in Armenia would welcome him with open arms. Oh, and by the way, Bagrat, probably Bagrat, right? That's probably how you actually pronounce that name. But if you read about this guy, Bagrat is totally the name we should go with. Now, Bagrat's an Armenian, and he probably thinks the king will hire Baldwin, to kick the Turks out of Armenia, and then he, Bagrat, will either end up with some really good position, or given how unpopular the current king is, maybe even become king.
Bagrat becoming king? Ambitious, aren't we?
So Baldwin gets Bagrat to introduce him to the king. And the king's a Christian, and he's childless, and he's desperately looking for support because he's unpopular enough not to have a power base in his own country. So Baldwin makes chummy with the king, and the king adopts him as an heir. And a few months later, Baldwin lets an assassination plot go through that he almost certainly knew about, and bang! Baldwin, only by selling out his adopted father, is now king of Armenia. But Bagrat, who may well have been noble of birth, as Bagrat was also the dynastic name of Armenian kings before they were all kicked out, he isn't happy at all. This isn't what he planned. So he starts making some noise about being discontented, which prompts some other members of the Armenian nobility who want to ingratiate themselves with Baldwin to accuse Bagrat of conspiring with the Turks. Baldwin, always a big one for loyalty and friendship, has him promptly arrested and tortured. But apparently not killed, by the way. That was my mistake on the show when rereading things to prepare for lies.
Oh, okay. So he's not dead.
I saw that apparently he escaped into the hills after being tortured by his friend Baldwin. And after this, Baldwin actually does recruit the local Christians to bulk up his army, takes his remaining knights, sweeps an ever-widening area, and creates the county of Edessa. So Baldwin wasn't actually incompetent, he's just kind of a jerk. Also in episode 5, when the Crusader foraging party just happens to run into reinforcements for Antioch, the Muslim reinforcements, that's because they were slowed down because they tried to take Edessa back from Baldwin on the way. I always think it's interesting to imagine what would have happened if they weren't. Think how differently this would have all turned out if those forces arrived behind the Crusaders as they were arrayed trying to still besiege Antioch. The First Crusade is so weird because it hinges on so many tiny twists of fate. Which of course brings us to Antioch. First off, Comet landed in the middle of the Turkish camp during this thing, and it's starting to get weird how many of these battles that we end up talking about have astrological events that just happen in the middle of them.
Like an aurora appeared during the night at Antioch. Like, what was happening? You know, you first have a meteorite and now you're having auroras in the sky. Like, wow.
And second, I have to talk about this awesome moment where the Crusaders are besieged. They're fighting on all sides, right? They're fighting desperately without rest. There are forces in the citadel, there are forces outside, and battles, not going great. And so, one at a time, men start to desert. But they're in the city, right? So they have nowhere to go. So these guys who desert, they just sort of hide out in the houses on the far side of the city. And Bohemond gets word of this. And Bohemond realizes they need those men. They're not going to win this fight without those extra men. But he also can't spare guys to go haul them out of these houses. So he sends a few men with the orders, just go light the whole district on fire. And so Bohemond just starts a cataclysmic blaze in the middle of an occupied city that he's trapped in. And it works.
That's crazy.
The guys rush out of the houses, which are now on fire, and there's nowhere to go but the front lines. So they're all back in battle. Oh, and that reminds me, if why the Muslim forces fled was at all confusing, here's a little bit better of a breakdown. Their commander was a guy named Kerboga, and he was the Atabeg of Mosul. Atabeg is basically a duke. And all the other Muslim commanders were lesser nobles under him, as was the way with feudal armies. They had to fight under his banner whenever he marched off to war, right? So, now the thing is, all these lesser commanders, all these lesser nobles, basically got nothing if Antioch was captured, and Kerboga, their Atabeg, would become even more powerful and be able to exert more control over them if he succeeded. Whereas if he failed, he'd be disgraced and they'd have more free reign and they could get back to their own fiefs rather than wasting all these resources on this stupid battle. So just as the European forces weren't one unified front, neither were the forces opposing them. And so as soon as the Europeans gave the Muslim forces an excuse that they could legitimately use to sort of flee, most of the sub-commanders were like, looks good to me, and hightailed it out of there, right?
I'm surprised that they weren't duly executed for their betrayal on the battlefield like this. But yeah, that's quite a surprise, really, how the Turks have also got their own fractured internal politics, and loyalty is not really present in the Turk armies, if I can say that. Yeah.
And it's one of those interesting cases where the interests of the nation are clear, but the human elements that theoretically are supposed to be supporting that nation have other conflicting goals.
Yeah, it's been compromised.
When you see those moments in history where you have to just scream out, why didn't they just do this? This is so often the case. We had another question from the Patreons. Our patron Anders asks, whatever happened to the forces that were holed up in that citadel? Well, funny story that. They surrendered, but they surrendered specifically to Bohemond. Somewhere in there, during all that chaos, Bohemond got someone to offer them terms so he could wind up with the citadel himself. And with Citadel, he'd wind up with control of the city. So rather than working all together as crusaders, he sort of did an end run and got them to give him this, which is one of the reasons that he ends up getting the city himself in the end. Oh, and on a totally different note, remember that clergyman who challenged the guy who claimed to have found the Lance of Longinus to a trial by fire?
Yeah, I remember.
For sacrilegious claims? Well, that clergyman, he later found the true cross. So suck on that.
How do we know it's the true cross? Just like the Lance of Longinus, how do we know that the one that's in Rome is the real one compared to the one that was found in Antioch is not? You know, these claims of they found a holy relic, I take them all with a pinch of salt, because I know humans. We know humans. We know what fuels us, and it's not faith mainly, it's greed. It's ambition.
Stephen was asking about Tancred conquering Bethlehem. And I wish there was a better story here, but basically he just swept it up real quick. There weren't any major forces there. Tancred did some smashing, grabbed up Bethlehem, and this is one of the reasons why when Godfrey is made the ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he decides to make Tancred the Prince of Galilee. Oh, speaking of which, you know in episode 6, when Raymond takes one side of the wall when they're assaulting Jerusalem and Godfrey and Tancred take the opposite side? This probably had less to do with tactical concerns than the fact that basically both Godfrey and Tancred really didn't like Raymond at this point.
Oh no, what's going on? Alright, there is something clearly going on. Hold on, just hold on a minute, I'll be right back. Alright, I am back. Let us continue. Yes.
Oh, speaking of which, you know in episode 6, when Raymond takes one side of the wall when they're assaulting Jerusalem and Godfrey and Tancred take the opposite side? This probably had less to do with tactical concerns than the fact that basically both Godfrey and Tancred really didn't like Raymond at this point. Though Raymond did one cool, if completely heartless thing during this. There was this dry moat around Jerusalem, and it would have stopped any assault just dead in its tracks, and they needed to fill it to assault the walls. But every time a group of soldiers tried to do so, they'd come under heavy fire, and soon no one was willing to try and fill it in. So Raymond, who was just exceedingly rich, offered everybody a penny to throw a stone or a cloud of earth into this dry moat. All of a sudden,
Man, like, how rich was this guy? Wow, Raymond.
a lot of people turned brave and the moat got filled. I have so much more, but I want to make sure we address some of the things that you guys raised in the comments. First off, there were some questions about Muslim atrocities. And the truth is, I try and show both perspectives and sort of see both sides in these things. And I try.
But, yes, definitely there were atrocities on both sides. But with the First Crusade, we are focusing on Europe, or should I say the Christian side of things, and their actions and what they have done. I'm sure maybe if Extra History wants to make one that focuses on, the Arabian Peninsula and the forces that were involved in the First Crusade, I'm sure we'll also hear about the atrocities committed by the Turks, definitely, because there were atrocities done by them as well. But it's just that with this entire series involving the First Crusade, we were dealing with the Christians and the Christian armies that were sent during the First Crusade. Yeah.
And represent them as much as I can without bias. That's why I made sure to call out the bishops who straight up heroically defended the Jewish populations of their towns. But the more that I read, the harder it was to really defend the Crusades. I mean, this thing was
like, you can't defend something that was purely out of a political decision. Pope Urban II didn't want to liberate Jerusalem because there was some sort of terrible situation happening there. It was nothing about that. It was purely for his own political survival. It was purely for the political survival of his organization, the church, belonging to his side of authority and not to the Pope that has been designated by the Holy Roman Empire. This was purely politically, pushed. And yes, you also have to add in Emperor Alexius Comnenus of the Byzantine Empire. Yes, his motives might seem to be far more legitimate in terms of, reclaiming the land that has been taken by the Turks in Anatolia. I understand that. And also making sure that the Byzantine Empire continues to be the bulwark against the expansion of the Islamic faith. I understand that part. But Pope Urban II was not here for any of that. This was purely a political decision. And this crusade, really, it was not necessary. Not in the fashion, not in the way or the manner it was created.
Mess. And while there were some acts of violence by the Muslims in the Holy Land before the Crusades, on a whole, for a conquest of this scale during this time period, the Muslim conquest and occupation was actually pretty benign. If you want to talk about Muslim atrocities, you look at their conquest of India, where they weren't dealing with people of the book. That's a whole nother story, a terrible and violent one, and one we may well cover someday. But I swear, I was trying to be as fair to the Crusaders as I humanly could be. And the thing is, we don't need to grasp at straws to find justifications for these men. This is part of our history, and we should look at it honestly. The fact that this is part of our history doesn't make us bad, or the church that these men believed in bad. It's something to learn from, and to help us understand the present.
And also just try our hardest not to repeat or not to emulate, not to go down that same path again. What has happened has happened. But let us not get back into that nonsense of religious fundamentalism, of religious dogmatic societies. These are the types of things that are dangerous, to any society, to any nation.
With that said, I want to get to the rest of your thoughts, so I'm going to try and rapid fire through a lot of these. First off, you're all 100% right on calling me out and saying Germany. There wouldn't be a Germany for almost 800 years.
Oh yeah. Yes, I did hear Germany when, he was talking about the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, okay. Now, I forgive you for that one.
Second, the indulgence thing. Basically, this is where the idea of mass indulgences spring from. But indulgences are super complicated, so I may have understood it wrong. My understanding is basically if you commit a sin and confess, you're assigned penance. And as I follow it, the offer here is that going on crusade counts as all your penance. So you confess all your sins, you're assigned penance, you go on crusade, boom, penance is wiped out. But many of you may understand this a lot better than me, so I totally defer to you guys in this one. Oh, and this is awesome. I get to do this. This is going to be fun. One I loved, it's going to be a comments lies. Priests didn't use bladed weapons. That came up a lot.
Priests didn't use bladed weapons? Oh, okay.
It's actually false. This is a myth that became part of our popular culture because of D&D. It's actually completely wrong. You can look at the Song of Roland, and Archbishop Turin, right, lays about with his sword of burnished steel. So this was just fantastic to me because I've made this mistake before. I ended up having to look it up because D&D taught me the same thing. And when I looked up years ago, it's always struck me, so it just amused me seeing that. Oh, and yes, in that vein, totally historically accurate that Raymond has a magic moving eye patch. And as mentioned here, Beaumont was actually clean shaven, had short hair. Our artist, when doing the original character sketch, was looking at a highly romanticized 19th century painting of him as a reference image, and I didn't see it till it was too late, and it would have been too confusing to change it. Oh, and whoever you are who made a YouTube account for Robert of Flanders just to pop in comment threads and say, "We cool," You are a hero. And in episode 4, some people were questioning 7-hour shield defense. This is actually fairly well attested to. As far as the singing goes, some people were asking, oh, would they really do that to inspire the troops? It was less to inspire the troops than an attempt by the priest to keep the civilians from panicking. Oh, and in episode 5, we mentioned that Antioch was founded by Alexander. This is false. It was founded by his general Seleucus. In episode 6, people wondered why the Genoese were showing up. They were just basically bringing supplies, but because an Egyptian fleet came in and blocked their way back home, the sailors just joined the crusade and let the crusaders take apart their ships for wood. Oh, also, the guy who found the lance of Longinus was not local. As we somehow said, he was from France. That's actually an editing error.
So another person from France claiming that God is speaking to him. Hey, no, there's another Peter the Hermit here. Oh, wow.
I forgot to delete a word from a sentence that I was changing, so the word local stayed in there wrong. I think that's about it for what I can remember from the comment threads, so I'm just going to lightning fast through the last patron questions. Let's just go through. Cameron asks about how the language barrier affected the Crusades.
Oh, that's a very important question, definitely. I mean, imagine people from the Byzantine Empire don't speak French. The people from France don't speak any dialect that was used in the Holy Roman Empire. The people in the Holy Roman Empire don't speak any dialect or languages that are used in Jerusalem. So it must have been very confusing.
Actually, I'm sure it had a big effect on the regular troops and kept them from sort of becoming one cohesive army. But overall, it had a lot less effect than you'd expect because all the nobles shared a few languages, at the very least Latin.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. Joshua asks why this is called the Princes Crusade when later crusades are called the Royal Crusade, and is that part of why it's more successful? And in fact, it actually might be, because it's called the Princes Crusade as opposed to later crusades, which were the Royal Crusades, because none of these guys were actually kings, right? They
had that fire in them, that desperation in them, that ambition to become, lords of their own kingdoms. Just like what happened with Baldwin, what happened with Beaumont. They have their own kingdoms to look after. So they had that ambition. All of these generals of the Crusader army had their own ambitions to become lords of their own lands, and maybe that's why they had such determination to conquer Jerusalem and all the other cities that lead up to Jerusalem. Yeah.
They were all noble people, but they weren't kings, which meant that many of them were out to carve their own kingdoms and to stay instead of to fight for a bit and leave and go back home to their own kingdoms.
I mean, you don't want to stay the second son of the king, or the second or the third son of the king of your home, of your birth country. You don't want to stay like that. You want to become your own king. You want to have your own realm. You want to have your own subjects. You don't want to go back to your brother and prostrate before him and return to court as just another brother in the line of succession. And you might actually be killed. Your brother might have you killed because you're a threat to him politically, or other nobles will have you killed because of your exploits in the crusade. You don't want to go back. You want to start something new.
Which probably did have an effect on sort of the tenacity of this crusade. Krista asks about civilian casualties and if there was any estimate for civilian casualties. Not that I can find. Unfortunately, people didn't really tally up peasants. Trevor wants to know if there were any stories that I didn't get to, but I was really interested in. The rest of Alexius Komnenos' reign, Alexius Komnenos is really interesting because he tries to wrench back the Byzantine Empire to some state of relevance. And I love to go deeper into it because from the little bit I got to look at, right, he's really successful in the time. He's a lot of really good ideas, but these ideas in the end are also some of the things which led to the eventual decline of the Byzantine Empire. Alexander asks about who the unsung heroes of the Crusades are. And I really thought, a lot of these bishops who defended the Jews really are unsung heroes. Like, you never hear about them. I thought some of them went above and beyond to try and protect people, which I thought was awesome. Tancred is my other favorite. The more I read about him, the more I liked him, and maybe because it's in contrast to some of the company he kept, but he's this kid who shows up and sort of just brought along by his uncle, and this is his journey to prove he's his own man. And as he struggles with that, and as he needs to prove himself a great warrior, he tries within the bounds of the time, but certainly more than anybody else there, to be humane. So I would say Tancred as well. Lastly, Paul asks, how much did the invasions of Spain and France have to do with calling of the Crusades? Specifically calling of this first crusade. And actually that's Spain and France, whole different thing. Urban II actually had to convince many of the knights who were fighting over in Spain to stay in Spain. He had to actually send out a special message saying, hey, we're going to give you guys all the same indulgence. Please don't stop the war over there to try and go over to Jerusalem. So there it is. Oh, and finally, to end things where all things end, Walpole. You may be asking yourself, how's he going to tie Walpole to the Crusades? But let me tell you, it's Walpole's son, who profiteered off the Crusades in the best possible way. He wrote the first Gothic romantic novel. And you may think I'm done. You may think, okay, case closed. This can't get any better than the sentence, first Gothic romantic novel. But how does this tie back to the Crusades? Well, you see, he didn't claim to write the book.
Oh.
He didn't even claim to pseudonymously write the book. He made up a fake person who then made up a fake story that this came from a fake attic of an ancient fake family, and that this was a translation of a work dating back from, you guessed it, the Crusades.
Wow. And he got his money. He got his money.
So Walpole runs in the family. And there you have it. Walpole in one. So join us next time for the greatest naval adventure of all time. The tale of an admiral who is seriously unsurpassed in the history of the world, and yet is little known outside of his native land. So yeah, join us next time for the tales of Admiral Yi.
Hey. Yeah, guys, I've already reacted to Admiral Yi. I don't know. Well, yeah, I'll compile it into a playlist, and then you'll be able to see the card at the top right here for all my reactions to that segment of Extra History. But yes, the First Crusade Extra History parts are complete, as well as the Extra History Lies, if I can say that. Yeah. That's the last video that we just saw right now, and yeah, it's been good to learn about this mess. It was a mess, really. The First Crusade was a mess in the beginning with the People's Crusade. It was a mess that stretched all the way from Hungary going down to Constantinople. It was a mess, and the people suffered. Christians suffered under the hands of other Christians. You know, and then of course we have to deal with Anatolia, how the people there were first suffering from the People's Crusade, and then came the official crusade led by the princes, or should I say the generals, and how the people suffered twice under the hands of people who claimed to be Christian as well. Yeah, unbelievable. And the many cities, or should I say fortified positions as well, that were, you know, under siege by the Crusader forces, like the city of Nicaea, the city of Antioch, the city of, what was it called again, Tripoli, the city of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and many other places as well that were under siege by the Crusaders and taken over. And how the people in those cities or in those settlements died in the hundreds, maybe thousands of people, you know. And for what? We just don't know. Because like I said before, I understand fighting against the armies, fighting against the defenders of the city, but I don't understand killing the civilians. Why are you doing that part? For what? They're no threat to you. None whatsoever. But yeah, it's just something I cannot understand. And the charlatans, we have to talk about the charlatans. We have to talk about Peter the Hermit, Walter, Sons of War, and Count Emiko. I'm surprised that these people are not dead. You know, that they were able to live in peace for the rest of their lives, while on their hands are the blood of the innocent people that have suffered due to the pillaging of their people's crusade. You know, and I'm also surprised that Peter the Hermit was not executed as a heretic, you know, for proclaiming that God is, you know, speaking to him and not speaking through the church to the people, but speaking to him as a prophet. I'm surprised, really. I would have expected him to be killed. You know, such audacious actions done by this Peter the Hermit. Really, I would consider it as a threat to the church, and I would nib this situation in the bud before it becomes worse. But yeah, you know, the church had other ideas, and he's lucky. Many other people were never this lucky. I'm sure many other people were never this lucky if they proclaimed to witness the saints, or you know, to have the voice of God in their ears, or to be anointed by the gods, or should I say by God, you know, to do a certain task. You know, I expect that the church would, you know, disavow those people, delegitimize them immediately, excommunicate them, or execute them on the spot, you know, for such heretic notions. But yeah, really, it was a surprise about Peter the Hermit. Yeah, Walter, Sons of War, I'm not sure if he's dead. I can't remember if extra history did specify that he died, but Count Emiko somehow survived all of this, and he was able to live out the rest of his life in peace. Really, it's unfair. It's unfair. And yeah, you know, the different generals that participated in this crusade, when you think about Hugh, Godfrey, Beaumont, Raymond, Robert, and Robert's, should I say his underlings, Robert of Normandy, Stephen of what's his, Blois? Yeah, Blois? Yeah. Boys, yeah, him. How they all, you know, fought against, you know, the defenses and the Turk armies, but also had their own ulterior motives. Even when they did swear an oath to King Alexius Comnenus, still, you know, they had their own formulated plans on how they're going to carve out their own little kingdoms. Some succeeded, like I think only 3 people succeeded, really, when you think about Beaumont, Baldwin, and who else? Godfrey, yeah. You know, only 3 people succeeded in carving out a kingdom of their own. Maybe also Tancred, right? I think also Tancred created his own kingdom. But everybody else, they came, they saw, they conquered, they went back home. They went back home. But yeah, it was a crazy time. 1095 CE was a crazy time. When Pope Urban II decided that he wants to do this, or he wants to proclaim this crusade, I don't know if he truly appreciates what he has done. You know, I wonder whether he truly appreciates what he has done by unleashing this catastrophe on innocent civilians. I wonder whether he truly feels any remorse for what he has done. But I guess we'll never know about that, you know. It's a victory for the Christian world, as they would say. And that's all that matters. But yeah, guys, that's it. Thank you again to MThraxCrab2222 for the requests. It's been really good. And remember, guys, if you want to check out the Extra History YouTube channel as well as the playlist of the 7 episodes or 7 parts of the First Crusade, I'm going to put the link in the description below. And yeah, that's it. If you like my reaction, please give me a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos. And I'll see you guys next time. Thank you again to Antioch. Thanks. Okay, guys. Bye-bye.